Welcome to the debate. Today, we are wrestling with a figure whose ideas are, well, foundational to modern power structures, Niccolò Machiavelli. Specifically, we're dissecting the core of his controversial philosophy, the strategic necessity of emotional and ethical detachment in effective political leadership.
And it's a concept that remains deeply uncomfortable, right? The central question we face is whether this cold, calculating detachment, the famous Machiavellian approach, provides the necessary and stable foundation for true sovereignty, or if this radical separation of power from moral considerations is in the end a recipe for systemic instability and profound vulnerability.
My position is that Machiavellian realism and detachment are not just tactical advantages. They're necessary means, the modern expression of virtù, required to achieve stable control and true independence. We simply cannot afford to build governance on idealistic illusions. We have to look at the world as it is, not as we wish it to be.
And I have to contend that the deliberate, radical separation of power from ethics, as laid out in The Prince, fundamentally undermines the long-term trust required for any genuine, enduring sovereignty. It delivers short-term tactical gains, yes, but I think it comes at the cost of terminal societal fracture.
Well, let's start with the necessity of realism. Machiavelli's genius, and why he really marks the foundation of modern political thought, is his unflinching focus on what is over what ought to be. Previous philosophers, Plato and Augustine, they sought to guide the state toward virtue or salvation. Machiavelli just looked at the actual behavior of people.
And what did he see?
He saw that true power requires intellectual realism, recognizing that men are generally not capable of being truly good because they are inherently self-interested, fickle, and selfish. Now, this isn't an immoral outlook. It's a logical, observational one. If the primary duty of the leader is to conserve the state, which is the highest goal, that leader just cannot base their governance on the naive assumption of public virtue or self-sacrifice.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the cost of that assumption? I grant that Machiavelli's insight into psychological self-mastery is valuable. A leader must indeed retain their emotions like an army before battle, managing their internal state to choose the optimal moment for action. Where we diverge is applying this personal discipline to justify political opportunism.
And why is that divergence necessary?
Because it encourages the ruler to maximize fear and exploit the people's negative characteristics, their wickedness, foolishness, and evil, for state interest. It turns the citizenry into a resource to be managed through manipulation rather than a people to be led by example or, a common purpose.
But it encourages the ruler to be effective, which is the ultimate form of leadership. Personal detachment is the absolute prerequisite for political stability. Think of it this way. If a prince is governed by his own personal feelings, his need for love, his personal anger, his craving for validation, he is so easily manipulated by fortuna, by uncontrollable circumstance, or by his rivals who exploit those very weaknesses.
Okay, that's a powerful point about internal discipline.
It is. It's the inner discipline made external policy. The ability to observe an emotion or desire without being ruled by it, to choose strategic indifference, it reverses the power dynamic. Machiavelli suggests that silence and withdrawal create respect because rarity amplifies value. This isn't coldness, it's a form of calculated political sovereignty.
But this doctrine fundamentally risks catastrophic failure because it relies on the systematic erosion of trust. Consider the brutal example of Cesare Borgia and the execution of Remiro di Orco. Borgia needed Orco to execute cruelties to unify the Romagna region. When stability was achieved, Borgia immediately had Orco brutally cut in half in the public square. And why? To disassociate himself from the necessary cruelties he himself had ordered, making the people both satisfied and stupefied.
It was a successful political tactic.
But this level of tactical ruthlessness contradicts Machiavelli's own warning. A prince should be feared, yes, but he must avoid being hated. That manufactured cruelty, followed by the manipulation of the public's outrage, creates a deep-seated hatred that only requires a minor spark, a conspiracy, a foreign threat,
to just explode. Stability cannot be built on an image of superficial virtue that the populace knows on some level to be false.
The populace, Machiavelli argues, judges more by the eyes than by the hands. So as long as the public sees the appearance of justice, even manufactured justice like the execution of a cruel scapegoat, their immediate emotional reality is satisfied. Borgia demonstrated strength and accountability. That's the difference between a philosophical ideal and political reality. The people don't require the ruler to be fundamentally good, they require the state to be orderly and secure.
I come at it from a different way. Let's delve into the core contention here. The efficacy of fear versus love and honesty. Machiavelli claims that political action must involve deceit because men are dishonest. He argues that it would be wrong to break promises if men were good, but since they are not, the prince is justified in deceiving them too. If the goal is stability, why sacrifice integrity and guarantee a perpetual state of hostility?
Because integrity is a liability in political competition, and honesty is just not effective. Fear is the only constant you can rely on. Love and affection are fragile. People can break those bonds of affection the moment their self-interest is threatened. However, fear, especially the fear of death and punishment, is much stronger than love. If the foundation of your rule is fear, your people remain submissive and manageable. A wise prince has to master the art of concealing his cunning.
That idea of concealment is the key danger, isn't it? The ruler becomes a master of simulation or a conjurer, relying entirely on a fabricated public image. I just don't see how stability can be built on an illusion, especially when Machiavelli himself holds up the unification of Italy, a noble long-term national goal, as the ultimate purpose of state preservation. If the means are entirely deceitful, they inevitably betray the supposed noble end.
I'd say the means are pragmatic, not deceitful. Machiavelli forces us to confront the reality that the majority of society fears death and punishment more than they cherish freedom or uphold abstract ethical standards. Therefore, the structure of political control must be built around those reliable, controllable fears. He observed the spectacular failures of idealists like Savonarola, who tried to lead Florence through piety, and Soderini, who failed through indecision. Machiavelli realized the people are simply not heroic or self-sacrificing. Political science must derive its principles from this inherent selfishness if it's ever going to succeed.
And yet, this detachment, which you claim is the source of control, so often turns into emotional insulation, hindering necessary political insight.
I disagree. Detachment is crucial because what you desire excessively takes power over you. And this applies to everything: external validation, political agreement, personal affection. Strategic indifference reverses the power balance. This isn't about being cold, it's about inner discipline, preventing the leader from making impulsive, destabilizing decisions based on their own emotional needs.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. Machiavelli applies deeply useful psychological observations, like the need to observe an emotion without acting on it, to justify state manipulation. When detachment is applied to governance, it becomes political opportunism, defined as utilizing the people's negative characteristics for state benefit. Doesn't this approach actively discourage the ruler from cultivating genuine civic virtue or trying to genuinely lead society toward improvement, preferring instead to just exploit their lack of wisdom?
But why attempt to cultivate virtue when all the historical evidence proves it is fleeting? Machiavelli offers a defense of the state, not an ethical handbook for citizens. His argument is that the ruler's virtue, his virtù, lies in their capacity for adaptability. The prince must be flexible enough to abandon goodness when circumstances require it for the state's survival. That flexibility ensures stability far more than rigid adherence to a moral code that their adversaries will certainly ignore.
This brings us squarely to the defining concepts of the text, virtù and fortuna. We've thrown these terms around, but we should probably unpack them fully. When Machiavelli discusses life as a struggle between the two, what specifically does he mean by virtù? It's often translated simply as virtue or prowess.
But it is much more complex than mere moral goodness.
For Machiavelli, virtù is political competence. It is the vigor, skill, and sheer force of will necessary to seize and hold power. It's the ability of the statesman to adapt their methods to the times, being both the lion strong and terrifying, and the fox who is cunning and deceptive. It is active mastery of circumstance.
And fortuna is the chaotic counterpart. It's luck, chance, fate, the uncontrollable river that constantly threatens to flood the carefully constructed dam of the state. Machiavelli argues we control about half of our actions, and virtù allows us to adapt to fortuna by building those defenses against the river.
Precisely. Virtù is the human effort to mitigate chaos.
So if virtù is truly the key to adapting and mastering circumstance, then why did Machiavelli himself fail so spectacularly when he applied his own insight? This is the ultimate counterexample to his own philosophy.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because a single personal failure does not negate the political insight of his observations. He wrote The Prince after being tortured and exiled, dedicating it to Lorenzo II de' Medici in a desperate and ultimately failed attempt to secure a position. This was a massive personal defeat by Fortuna.
Exactly. His failure suggests that even the most extreme application of political insight and calculated realism can be defeated by simple bad fortuna, or perhaps more importantly, by the fact that his ideas were considered so radical, so antisocial, that they made him toxic to the ruling elite. If the doctrine of a moral flexibility is so effective at securing power, why did the author remain powerless? His own strategic detachment created suspicion and vulnerability among the very people he sought to impress.
But his philosophy was a guide for future leaders operating within a system where these ruthless dynamics were already in place. It wasn't a guaranteed personal career path. The core lesson remains: virtue requires the ruler to be completely flexible, ready to act morally or immorally as circumstances demand, always prioritizing the conservation of the state above all else. He says, the habitual defect of man is not to foresee the storm when the weather is fine. Cultivating that internal discipline and detachment today protects against tomorrow's political chaos. That flexibility, which flows from his detachment, is the only sustainable form of sovereignty in a dangerous, competitive world.
Yet, that flexibility becomes intrinsic instability when it requires the constant simulation of virtue. When the ruler is encouraged to maximize the people's fear and exploit their lack of wisdom, they become reliant on keeping the public perpetually fooled. That is an impossible long-term goal. The moment the populace realizes, and they will eventually realize, that the ruler is fundamentally a self-interested actor and a liar, the foundation just dissolves. You are left with a massive crisis of legitimacy.
In the end, sovereignty is maintained by controlling what you can, your internal self-mastery and your people's most reliable fears, and adapting constantly to what you cannot, which is fortuna. Machiavelli's doctrine is a tough but necessary realization that political success relies on observing reality and applying strategic detachment. The ability to feel without being governed by one's desires is the ultimate personal power, and that translates directly into political stability.
I'd say that while Machiavelli correctly identified the profound importance of self-control and adaptation, his choice to completely divorce politics from ethics and encourage the manipulative use of fear ultimately creates a house built on sand. Instability arises precisely when the populace realizes the gap between the world the ruler pretends should be and the calculated reality of their ruler's deception. He sought stability through amoral means, but morality is simply the social contract made visible. Shredding that contract guarantees future conflict.
Ultimately, Machiavelli forces us to confront the profound and enduring tension between the ideal state and the harsh, uncomfortable realities of human nature. It's a tension that remains absolutely central to modern governance and our understanding of power today.
Indeed, his work isn't merely a prescription for evil, but a chillingly clear description of how power often operates. And it compels every leader and every citizen to ask whether that operational reality, one founded on distrust and calculated ruthlessness, is truly sustainable, or if it is merely self-sabotage waiting for the next flood of fortuna.